The Vikings. Did they really exist? I put it to you that the Vikings didn't exist. I'm going to qualify this somewhat because I dare say I've confused quite a few people, but that's sort of the point of this video, in that an awful lot of people are very confused about the term the Vikings. So confused, in fact, that I'm coming around to the opinion that we should just stop using the term entirely because people don't understand what is meant and they end up drawing some bizarre conclusions because of the confusion. Some people are confused in that they think that all Vikings were warriors because they were some sort of warrior race because they were Vikings, right? And a Viking is a raider, right? You know, one of those guys who leaps off a long ship with a big axe and so forth. And so anyone who is a Viking must be a raider and a warrior. And this leads people to really amazingly stupid conclusions, such as that reached by a number of people recently. There was a bit of a hoo-ha on the internet, I don't know if you saw it, about a few graves that were found in England, and some of them were Viking men, and some of them were Viking women. And some people went, oh, do you know what this means? Half of Viking warriors were in fact women. Just look at the archaeological evidence. No. Half of Viking warriors were not women. They were just the graves of some women buried alongside some men. And yes, you could say that these were Viking men in that they were sort of Nordic types with Nordic brooches and other grave goods. But if you've been buried in an orderly fashion in graves alongside each other in England, then presumably what you are, in fact, Scandinavian settlers. I mean, if you were raiders and you were unsuccessful, you were killed in a raid and your fellows were beaten back, do you think the locals would give you a nice burial with all your grave goods, all in an orderly fashion in a graveyard? No, that almost certainly didn't happen. The fact that you're buried in a graveyard suggests that you are quite definitely living the settled life. This is where you live. Perhaps those women were in fact local women who had taken on Scandinavian customs and wearing the brooches and so forth, but just as likely, perhaps more likely, is that they were women from Scandinavia who'd come over and joined their husbands who had settled in England, which is really quite a straightforward thing to do. If you find a load of people buried, that doesn't mean that they're warriors just because they're Vikings, but wait a minute, they must be because Vikings are warriors, right? And that's the problem. You see, another word, the confusion in the other direction is that people think of the Vikings as all of the people living in the Viking world, that is Norway and Sweden and Denmark and perhaps Iceland. Well, they're all sort of one people in that they all spoke a version of Norse, quite a few different versions, so a lot of them would have had quite a bit of trouble talking to each other. But yes, they were all sort of a people, but they weren't all Vikings, they weren't all raiders. The vast majority of them were farmers and traders and, you know, ordinary people doing ordinary stuff. In fact, even the people who went raiding couldn't have gone raiding all that often. Imagine that there's a 5% risk of getting killed on a raid. Well, you wouldn't have to go on many raids, would you, before you're probably dead. You couldn't make a life out of raiding. So a small number of these Scandinavians went on some raids. And yet we now think of them as Vikings, and we use this word Vikings to refer to this entire culture. And people start saying, oh, well, Viking women used to do X, Y, Z. Viking women? What the heck is a Viking woman? Women didn't go on raids. You even hear Viking babies. Viking babies were taught to do such and such by the age of whatnot, and were fed on this. There were no Viking babies, okay? There were no 1-year-olds with a shield and a helmet running around, leaping off long ships and attacking Lindisfarne. No, there were no Viking babies or Viking women or Viking old folk. It's a bit like, imagine today, there are lots of people in the society that we live in who are accountants. So is this accountancy culture? If you're from that society, you must be an accountant, right? And if you get married to a woman, then there's a woman accountant, and then you have a baby accountant. No, you don't. We don't live in accountancy society. Similarly, in Sweden, they didn't live in Viking society. They just lived in that society which was full of, normal people doing normal stuff almost all of the time. So perhaps we should stop using the term Viking. It's very confusing. If you go to the Jorvik Centre, as I did admittedly a few years ago, they may have changed it slightly. The Jorvik Viking Centre in York is a major tourist attraction. And as you're outside queuing for your tickets, it says, "The Vikings! They came, they raided, they plundered, they burned. And it has pictures of guys with axes leaping off long ships and burning long houses and so forth. And then you get in and think, oh, Vikings, they're brilliant. And you pay your ticket and you go in and you see the Vikings. They traded in amber. They kept chickens. They went to the lavatory. They did all the normal stuff that normal people do. So perhaps we should just stop calling these people Vikings, because Vikings isn't really a term for a people. A bit like accountants isn't the term for the society we live in. Vikings is not a word for the Norse world. Perhaps we should just call them Norse or Nordic or Scandinavians of the late Dark Ages or something else, but not Vikings, because it really is misleading. Lindybeige!